One.
Our speaker today is John Daken. He has been a member of the ethical movement for over 25 years. He pursued training for professional ethical cultural leadership in 2005 to 2007 before disenrolling in favor of lay leadership roles. He went on to serve as president of the Washington Ethical Society and is presently a board member of the American Ethical Union. He makes his home in Silver Springs, Maryland. We welcome you. Thank you for coming.
All right. I have a clicker. I'm not afraid to use it. I'll give it a try. Probably a little closer to wherever you. That'll be good. Yeah, that way I can look at my. We all set? All right, great. So it is such a treat to come here to visit you all. I'm pleased to have visited your larger neighbor, the Ethical Society of St. Louis, but have never been out to Charles County and to visit you all. And I'm so appreciative to Bill and Jill All, who I've gotten to know through my work in the AEU, for hosting me and introducing me to your wonderful new space. It's so wonderful to see that you all have now got really been able to put down some roots for yourself, and it's just great. I'd like to start by talking a little bit about terminology. In common usage, a leader is identified as a person who directs or organizes other people. In the ethical culture tradition, however, the word is typically reserved for individuals who have undergone special training in ethics, public speaking, etc., and who are certified by our National Board of Directors. Giving such a common, important word a proprietary meaning creates some unfortunate confusion. Take, for example, the entirely true statement that the Ethical Society of Mid-Rivers has no leader. What exactly does that mean? It means only that this society has no certified ethical culture leader on staff. It doesn't, however, necessarily mean that there are no leaders here. Do you ever delegate authority to one or more individuals and, at least for a period of time, follow where they lead you? Are you ever in a group from the society getting ready to go out to eat and everyone's uncertain where to go until someone steps in and makes a suggestion and you follow that suggestion? Every time that happens, someone is serving as a leader here. All of us, regardless of education or station, have the capacity to step up and lead. My talk will delve into the different types of leaders in our tradition. So you'll hear me add the modifiers: volunteer on the one hand, and professional, or perhaps certified, on the other. I speak to you as someone with a bit of a unique personal history, having started out as a lay leader. I was on the board of my home society in Washington, and then decided I wanted to try to pursue a career in this tradition, before then deciding that it just wasn't for me, but I stayed engaged as a lay leader, and have had an opportunity to get a real feel for the different sorts of roles, and I decided this is where I felt I could best lead. If you will follow me along the train of thinking about leadership as I'm suggesting, I hope we can all ultimately see that being unpaid provides no guarantee that a person will lead with integrity and skill. And as a general matter, being paid does not necessarily cause a person to lead poorly. Volunteers sometimes dip their hand into the petty cash drawer. Professionals sometimes soar. Some leaders are born, but plenty of others are made. Leadership skills can be taught, and effective systems of accountability can and do help ensure that people lead in the interest of those who depend upon them. Our movement features a cadre of people trained to step into a particular clergy-adjacent role in our ethical societies, and who make the case for benefits that will follow from their doing so. Sometimes the counterargument to this implies that leadership writ large is unnecessary. About 15 years ago, I visited the Chicago Ethical Society in Skokie, where I was told with pride that the society had no leader. I had recently decided not to pursue training to become a professional leader myself, so I was generally receptive to their implied critique of that role. However, I still felt moved to ask them how things got done in this leaderless organization. I was told they had a president and a board of trustees. I asked them how they provided comfort for members experiencing loss, and was told that certain members provided such support to others. I asked how they provided classes in ethics for youth and adults, and were told that certain members provided such education. It would seem, I said, that the Ethical Society did indeed deploy ethical culture leadership. They eventually conceded the point. But I've still mentally returned to that conversation over the years since. What was it about certified leaders that made them unwelcome at the Chicago Ethical Society? I eventually came to the conclusion that it was the culture of professional leadership in our tradition. Our movement had a difficult time leaving behind a style of professional leadership established by our founder, Felix Adler. In my presentation, I'll make the case that Adler's approach had some significant flaws, and then propose to you that it is possible to have the best of both worlds, to have the option to avail ourselves of professional leaders, especially for our larger societies, while remaining true to a philosophy that recognizes the unique capabilities of every person, including everyone's capacity to wield authority, to be leaders in their own right. It's a big reach, but here goes. As a first step, I'd like to try to unpack our common understanding of how our movement has been held together over the 150 years of its existence. I'm going to offer 3 theories. I'll take them each in turn, but I'll tell you ahead of time that I'm going to make the case that none of them hold up. And then I will suggest a 4th. The first, a shared commitment to doing good deeds. In his 1876 founding address, Adler acknowledged an ever-increasing diversity of thought before boldly declaring that unanimity could be easily found in shared action. He proclaimed, quote, "Diversity in the creed, unanimity in the deed." Well, I have joined you all in a state in which you are probably quite aware of diversity of the creed. In fact, you may be the diversity. Well, if Adler is correct, then I would expect the state of Missouri to be able to find unanimity in the deed on a woman's right to choose, trans rights, immigration policy. I mean, how's that going? So, perhaps not so easy as Adler proposed. Honestly, coming to you from a very blue state, it's difficult even among like-minded people. I live in a progressive, intentional co-housing community. Yet it's not uncommon for us to encounter major disagreements when we have to make an action decision. When this occurs, we find it useful to pull back and elucidate the values underlying the various positions that are being taken up by the various parties. We work to coalesce around common philosophical ground and deploy that common understanding as a way to bridge divides and choose an action congruent with that shared understanding. But for the sake of argument, let's grant that sometimes groups of people can find success by focusing on good deeds. I mean, after all, your wonderful website talks very strongly about finding unanimity in the deed. Let's, however, look at how a focus on deeds has operated in the movement at large. I would put to you that it has not really served as a recipe for success of the movement overall, as distinguished from a multitude of other social service organizations. How can deed alone distinguish an ethical society from, for example, the St. Louis Area Food Bank? I pulled this from their website and I invite you to take a look. As you can see, they feature an inspiring mission statement that emphasizes good deeds. In fact, various initiatives taken by people affiliated with the ethical movement were either independent from day one or soon made that transition. Examples include the Visiting Nurses Association, the NAACP, and the Fieldston School. Clearly, the movement has always placed some emphasis on action, but without some other factor, I don't see how the movement could have held together as long as it has. So, if deeds alone cannot and have not been a sufficient organizational glue for our movement, perhaps it has been a shared philosophy. Adler talked a lot about deed, but he also, especially in private with other professional leaders, emphasized a particular philosophy. Eventually, he decided that it was necessary to publish this philosophy so it might serve as a touchstone for the movement's members at large. An ethical, I'm going to say feel a little like a certain president who held this up. Sorry.
Is it upside down?
Oh, here we go.
Yeah, upside down.
There we go. Which kind of fits my overall theme, because I'm really not a big Adler fan, and so I think maybe it is appropriate to fly it upside down here. But I mean, I did read it, and there's lots of stuff in the margins where I say, huh? He published this. Let me find where I am. He published it in 1918, 40 years into his time at the helm of the movement. In it, he laid out 3 tenets that most of you probably encountered in one form or another. They are an ideal of the whole, an ethical manifold in which every person contributes an indispensable element. Number 2, as such, every person possesses inherent worth and dignity. They are ends in themselves, never a means to some other end. Given this, the highest good is achieved when each of us acts in a way so as to elicit the best in others, which thereby elicits the best in ourselves. Each layer of the philosophy feeds into the one that follows, and the reverse also applies. Eliciting the best from other people helps ensure the thriving of each unique and indispensable element, which in turn helps ensure the perfection of the whole. As maybe you can tell, I'm kind of fond of this framework. Nevertheless, I would argue that in Adler's lifetime and in the generations that followed, it was not operative as the glue that held the movement together. For one thing, Adler publicly disavowed his philosophy as a guide for the people who listened to his lectures and joined ethical societies. He intentionally chose to title his book An Ethical Philosophy of Life rather than The Ethical Philosophy of Life. He denied that its contents were a pronouncement on behalf of the ethical culture movement. The ethical societies, he wrote, have no official philosophy. For another thing, for all of his disavowals, he also felt that his philosophy did convey moral truths, but he held them in himself. He considered them to be objective and discernible only by particular wise men. I love the History Makers video we just saw. After all, Adler did not support women's suffrage in his lifetime. I would argue that a philosophy, first of all, that's disavowed, and second of all, that's considered discernible only by particular people, cannot bind together the members of a movement. The weakness of Adler's philosophy as a binding force was laid bare after his death in 1933, when diversity of the creed soon began asserting itself amongst Adler's many proteges, and that continued in the decades that followed. So that's two. So let's move to a third potential organizing force, which might be called organizational loyalty. In my 2 decades of involvement with the national ethical movement, I've sensed the emergence of a culture of institutionalism. I focus on policies, structures, finances, branding, not as a means to an end, but as ends in themselves. There is a rich body of research on organizations like ours, and it characterizes this administrative focus as a feature of institutions reaching the end of their lifespans. Such institutions lose their connection to the inspiration and relevance that inspired their creation and expansion. In its place, they become overly focused on their organizational machinery. They cease to look up and out. Instead, they begin to look down and in. In my view, the only plausible organizing force for most of our movement's history is a fourth factor, something that we may not like to admit. That what may very well have been holding our organization together has been the gravitational pull of a series of charismatic individuals, starting with our founding father himself. Felix Adler towered over the movement, serving as its founder and its driving force for 56 years. Adler was not called to leadership by the people he addressed from the podium. As far as I know, he did not depend upon a collection basket or financial pledges for his salary. Rather, he relied upon a small number of wealthy benefactors. It's my understanding that this pattern continued for many years and was true for leaders of many other early ethical societies. I would argue that it was the person of Felix Adler who held the community of ethical culture leaders together, and those leaders in turn fulfilled a similar function in the ethical societies that they led. This was a time when society boards of directors were deferential to their professional leaders rather than the other way around. I was told that the board of the New York Society would stand and rise to their feet when Dr. Adler walked into the room in a sign of deference and respect. Accountability for leaders was left to the man at the top, who in turn was accountable only to his conscience and to his conception of a higher plane of ethical truths. I would argue that a coherent social action agenda was possible for the movement only because of this centralized leadership structure. Some projects were sufficiently tethered to Adler that they remained within the official boundaries of the movement for a longer time. But many, if not most, projects were never extensions of an ethical society, nor of the movement as a whole, as I mentioned before. We claim them only because individuals affiliated with the movement pursued those initiatives under their own power. And, as fond as I am of Adler's philosophy, I need to point again that it originated from the mind of one man and was sustained in the various ethical societies by his lieutenants. Even today, the walls of older ethical societies are more likely to feature framed pictures of their past professional leaders than illustrations of the values those societies hold dear. So where does that leave us? If you're like me, you see some value in a lightly held grounding philosophy, so long as it never hardens into dogma. So I had a great pleasure to bump into your website architect, and I was commenting. I think she overheard me commenting how much I loved a section of your About Us page on your website, and there was this wonderful list of what you're all about or can be about. And this struck me as an example of a lightly held center of gravity. You stand for something. There's no dogma here, but you do stand for something. You invite people in and they know what to expect. So, if you're also like me, you see some value in effective leadership of some kind to keep an ethical society operating effectively. I'll talk about each of these in turn. If our grounding philosophy comes neither from an invisible realm nor from the mind of a charismatic leader, what is its source? Perhaps it comes from all of us, each one providing a unique contribution. Inherent worth and dignity, anyone? And if all of us are the sources of ethical truths, quote unquote, is there a role for professional clergy? Here is where I may disagree with some of you. I have seen that, particularly in larger organizations, professional leadership offers significant benefits. Once a society's membership exceeds 100 or so, it becomes increasingly difficult to sustain high-quality programming without someone on salary. In addition, a professional is more likely to be able to provide high-quality short-term counseling, end-of-life support, etc. These things can be provided by volunteers, but it's challenging without ongoing training and support from a professional. A number of organizations, including the American Humanist Association, the Humanist Chaplet at Harvard, the Sunday Assembly, the Oasis Movement, have attempted to scale up communities without inspirational professional leadership, and they have all struggled. I believe that it is possible to have the best of both worlds, if several factors are kept in mind. First, our egalitarian traditions call for leaders who are deferential to the wisdom of the group. This is not unheard of. Consider the humble roles typically played by clergy in the Quaker tradition. It has been suggested that this inclusive orientation helped the Quakers become among the first white people in America to embrace the abolition of slavery. Quaker meetings are part of a rich tradition of circle-oriented governance that helps ensure that no one becomes too impressed with themselves. I know it well from my experience within my consensus-oriented co-housing community, which draws its founding influences from the Quaker traditions. Second, I think it's important to cultivate capable boards of directors who are bold enough to partner with a professional leader, if they have one, in matters of philosophy and visioning, and at the same time are adept at supervising their employee. There is a lot of training available from a variety of sources for everyone involved in this. Third, I believe our movement could explore innovations to ensure robust accountability for everybody involved. Professional leadership is not necessarily problematic, just like volunteer leadership is not necessarily benign. By bringing intentionality to how we approach ethical culture leadership writ large, I believe we can revitalize our ethical societies and the larger ethical movement. Thank you.
Are you going to take questions?
As you wish.
I was going to say, does anyone have any questions?
I do.
Have at it.
So interesting approach, the three approaches, the one that you prefer and all that. How would you take this and apply it to our society?
The question is, how would I take my thesis and apply it to Mid-Rivers Ethical Society? So first of all, I want to answer with a great deal of humility. I'm a visitor here, and I want to say this is just general ideas. So first of all, I would think about what I said and think about how you would apply it, because you all are the leaders. I think what I tried to make the case for is as you scale up. So one of the things you can ask yourselves is, how do we take these functions and we deploy them in our society? Because what I would say is the functions are necessary regardless of how you staff yourselves. You want to have, if one member of your community is ill, or a family member dies, you want to be there for them, right? So you have to ensure that function, and you do, as I understand it. You want to be able to ensure some sort of coherence to your Sunday morning experiences. One of the things that professionals do is they think very carefully about the Sunday morning experience. I learned about these things during my brief time as a trainee, that they think very carefully about, what is the arc of the Sunday morning experience? Will you have certain themes that you see, or will you kind of move back and forth between different things? One of the things that our leader at the Washington Ethical Society, former leader, would say to me when I would deliver a platform, because I delivered a couple platforms as a non-clergy person for many years, and he would say, see if you can find a way to tie it back to the philosophy. So the idea would be that we would not merely be a lecture society, but we'd be a place where we have a common thread that binds everything together. And then when you come on a Sunday, you kind of know you're going to see some way to, so for example, I'm a mental health professional. That's my day job that I kept rather than pursuing professional leadership. I am always thinking about how my particular values, for example, about inherent worth and dignity, how they inform my work as a therapist. If you kind of find ways to tie it back to the philosophy, then that helps people say, oh, okay, right, these values help me understand, women's leadership a little bit better. It helps me appreciate the issues of the day in my state, in my community, etc. So that's a function that's valuable. So you can decide, is it working well to do it using volunteers? At some point, if you keep growing the way you are, you may just start to notice that your volunteers are getting kind of burned out, and it could be nice to have someone that you can depend upon, because it's partly their job to kind of keep all the things structured together. I didn't include some of the innovative kinds of accountability ideas I had, because I felt that was a little too much in the weeds for a talk to everyone. But I'd be happy to talk privately about some of the ideas I've been thinking about how you avoid. I gave a talk entitled Ethical Culture as Family, in which I pointed out that treating an ethical society like a family sounds really warm and fuzzy, but it can have some unintended consequences, because your professional can begin to be perceived as like a parent figure. And if that begins to happen, then the members begin to feel like kids. And kids dream about holding their parents accountable and whatever. But in fact, parents often can escape accountability. And so that's not a great model for how you want to do an ethical society. So how do you avoid developing a system where you have an inspirational person up front, but who begins to loosen the tether of accountability despite even their best intentions? And I think there are some ways I could talk about the way you structure your organization. I don't think you're anywhere near that kind of point for this organization, and I do appreciate the zest with which you embrace your volunteer orientation. But there are some things you can keep in the back of your minds if and when you ever wanted to have someone professional, part-time or whatever. I hope I've done justice to your question. It's a big one.
What I expected.
I think your point, I think it was your third point, that looking down and inward, I think that the leadership and ethical culture has been profoundly guilty of that, and I think that has seriously weakened the overarching goal of societies, or it has not helped them to grow. So I think most people here when they join are like, what's the AAU, right? Like kind of not a sense of how that could or should play a role. And I think when you talk about growth, the family model, right? Obviously that's what the Catholic Church does. Everybody's a father, right?
Yep.
So I think looking at it in terms of how a well-run organization would, where you develop a strategic plan and the strategic goals are driving all of the efforts that you're doing throughout the year. And you look at that every year. And basically empowering people. So whether you have, Bill made this point last night, so whether you have a leader that is paid or not, because obviously, yes, there are leaders, that leadership, whether paid or not, is empowering, just like in a well-run organization, managers are empowering the employees to move forward bravely and with confidence. So I think that that's not a terrible model for leadership.
One of the things, and I can give folks who are interested a link to my talk about ethical society as family. But one of the things that I shared was that in my brief time as an ethical culture leader in training, I was introduced to a viewpoint that saw professional leaders in our tradition as operating on kind of a different plane. And again, I put this at Adler's feet. I think this was put in place over a century ago. And so that tradition interferes with what you just said. Whereas if we have an orientation that the wisdom lies amongst everyone, then of course, why would you ever keep someone out of something as important as visioning? One of the reasons I'm still in this movement is that my society hired a leader from outside our tradition, but who has learned a lot about it, who I think really takes seriously this idea that they're not a Quaker, but they definitely they come out of UUism, but have somewhat occasionally ambivalent relationship with UUism because it can have its own kind of traditions. But UUism, my society is jointly a member of the American Ethical Union and the Unitarian Universalists. What's interesting is that even though UUs have some of the trappings of Christianity, their organizational culture is far more oriented towards independence of local members of their churches than our tradition, which has a very top-down patriarchal orientation. It's ironic, but I really do see it, and I was briefly attended a UU seminary. So the person we have full-time for us, I've seen it in operation. They really listen. And I hope it stays that way. They're relatively new, but I think you're 100% right. I was, after our leader of 34 years, Don Montagna, left, we really had to take a look at how concentrated authority had become in our society. And as it happened, both my society and your neighbor, the St. Louis Ethical Society, pursued governance revisions, and we used the same book, which it was entitled Governance and Ministry, trigger warning, but what it pointed out was that lay people, to use a clergy-lay distinction, if I can use those terms, that the volunteers need to govern. But there was a particular role for the clergy to minister, to care, to inspire, and that the author believed that both working together was the ideal combination, that you do hire this person, if you do hire someone with some inspirational ideas, we were talking about this in the car on the way over here, it makes sense to give them an opportunity to offer some of their ideas as long as they don't totally drive the train, but they work in partnership with the board of the volunteers in the visioning. So I agree with everything you said, and I'm curious what you think of my elaboration of what you said.
Good. I think part of that visioning has to also be a continuance plan, and I see that as a weakness. Like that is because
Sure.
you do have people that step up and volunteer and put their all in. What's the continuance plan from that? And that is what a paid leader might give you.
I agree. One of the things we'd implemented was a 5-year cycle of strategic planning.
Mm-hmm.
Some turnover and then a pandemic got in the way of that, but we're hoping to re-engage with that. But I agree with you. You can't just do it once and then let it go.
Oh, no, it's every year. It's looking at what you tried to achieve. Did you achieve it? Did all of the volunteer efforts that were being put forth, did they support whatever strategic goals you set forth?
Sure.
Yeah.
At the Washington Society, we do a near-term strategic plan every year, but then I'm also talking about a visioning exercise, which is a much more in-depth process involving everybody, and you can't do that every year, it'll exhaust people.
Yeah.
So we combine near-term every year with every 5-year bigger.
Nice.
We try anyway. Anyone else? Thank you for these questions and comments. Please.
One other thing to your idea, your point about like I'm trying to avoid like a very strong like father figure leader type society is when that person goes, a lot of people go with them. Like that person retires or leaves, people are left feeling like, you know, oh, there's no leader anymore. What's the point of me going anymore? So a lot of people feel so attached. You know, we went through that here.
You've been around long enough to be part of the transition when Bob Greenwell
Yeah.
departed. I think that is part of the problem indeed. I mean, when Adler was nearing the end of his life, I learned only recently that he felt that the ethical movement should die with him. Yep.
Strange.
Isn't that something? I mean, it was such his baby.
Wow.
I mean, sometimes it boggles my mind. The more I learned about this man and the early movement, I was like, why am I here?
Yeah. How did his movement even survive him?
Yeah.
Well, and that's a really good question. And like I said, I was in the halls of our clergy community. I mean, it survived in part because of really loud and proud clergy leadership, which often is about the person. Why do you think there are all those pictures that are on the walls? Because they move. You mean, so, you know, the kids are adopted by someone new is a little like the model, and it kind of makes my skin crawl a bit. I think there are ways that you deal with that. Plenty of organizations out there who are not Sunday organizations, but just straight up secular organizations have this problem. And the way they manage it is they manage transitions. You know, the St. Louis Society has an interim leader. We had a leader for 34 years, and he wanted just to leave and just have a successor appointed as soon as he left. And we said no, and we insisted on having a 2-year cooling off period, because if it was just about Don, if you all were just about Bob, is that really what we're about? It's about something bigger than one person, and anyone who's doing their job well is going to help ensure that it's about all of us, and so there is possible to have a transition. And I'm sorry to hear that it was rough during that process. Our movement is not good about transitions at all, but I think that's partly because it's so small. We have so few. I mean, you for example, they have 1,000 congregations. We have 22 now, actually, and yeah. Hi.
Hi. In October, the youth for the YES program, we were called to discuss like the future for the YES program and to advocate for it. And when the youth showed up and started to speak about this program, they sort of dismissed us and just went over us and canceled. Like just canceled and just dismissed what we were saying. And we're like, okay. Pushed us aside, and I just wanted to add on and ask when the youth of the society are going to be like, our voices matter.
So I want to repeat what you said. Please remind me your name. Kira, and I know Kira because I have a daughter roughly Kira's age, and her mom and Kira and me and my daughter and a couple other folks attended a very small but very spirited Youth of Ethical Societies conference last spring. And I do know that there was an invitation for folks to come and talk about what they saw as the future for youth in the movement. And I just learned that my daughter didn't attend, I don't think. And we were just told that when the youth started to express themselves, the response was to not take that in and not to pursue a program this year. So hard to respond to that, only to say, I'm so sorry. I'm on the board of the national movement, but in its wisdom, the Assembly expanded the board from 13 to 25 people. And you're probably a little too young to understand how organizations work, but 25 people to make any major decisions, and that didn't come to our awareness, so I'm only learning about that now. I'm sad to say. I mean, so our the national movement, I guess what I want to say is the American Ethical Union is not the ethical movement. It is a nonprofit that exists to serve ethical societies. And what I'm hearing you say is you are not feeling served by the American Ethical Union. And I'm really very sorry. I hope that your representative to the AEU board, who I think is teaching right now, that you've talked to her about that. Have you shared with her what happened? And let's talk a little bit afterwards, because we have a youth group. My daughter's still involved, and maybe we can find ways to work from one society to another to do some good things. Thank you for speaking up, Kira.
Yep. I mean, that's one way that I think that looking down and inward has really not served the societies, where like we have actively reached out to families. Like, I don't understand the AEU's thinking that you don't need kids to grow. Like, take a page out of the Catholic's book, would you?
Well,
Like it just seems to be that it's always been a little bit of an afterthought.
well, I don't know. I think we don't have the other side of the story right here this morning, and so I hesitate for us to draw too firm a conclusion as to what was going on in their response. I know that last spring, the AEU generously funded the YES conference at a time when they weren't swimming in funding. So something must be up. I'm not sure I understand. But one of the things that my own society has been a skeptic of the AEU in years past, and one of the reasons was that the AEU tried to be all things to all people when it just didn't have the funding or the scope. And sometimes it's worth an organization to recognize its limits and to be willing to be creative in terms of how societies get their needs met. And so maybe it's simply that, I don't know the whole story, but I guess all I want to say is that I think there is no reason why the societies, really the three societies with the most robust youth programs, you probably have the largest one in the movement at the moment, and good on y'all. But St. Louis and my society, Zoom is a wonderful connector, so there are options there.
So, leader training,
This is gonna be the last question.
which the AU is not offering any longer currently, is that something that is useful in your thinking?
So my friend Matthew Heil is here from the St. Louis Ethical Society, is asking about leader training, and he's asking, is that useful in my opinion? Training is always useful. I don't want to say I'm never going to be voting against training. But I think the real question is our national organization up to the task of preparing professional leaders to be out there serving societies? Is that a fair restatement of your question? And I will answer by saying what I decided when I applied for ethical culture leadership training, because I was interested perhaps in the job that was opening up at the Washington Ethical Society. A society of, at the time, had over 300 people, the second largest in the movement behind only St. Louis. And that the people who were going to be training me all came from smaller societies, and some of the people doing the instruction had not led a society at all. Partly a function of how small we had become. They were doing their very best, but I recognized pretty quickly the limits on what I was likely to be able to learn in the program. So that was why I looked for the closest analog to our tradition, and I decided the UUs were close enough. There are quite a few humanists in the UU community. So I enrolled in their seminary. So, the theology class was pretty hard to take. But I hung in there because I also wanted to learn about, how do you inspire a group on a Sunday morning? How do you organize a good talk? How do you understand the finances of an organization? All these different things to make an organization that size operate. And then my intention was to supplement that with the ethical culture specific things that only people in our tradition could offer. I ended up leaving in part because the culture that I was seeing within our tradition, but the overall idea I think is sound. I think that a model in which we recognize we can't provide everything, and so we intentionally, kind of contract with others to help us out while holding on to the thing we really know how to do, which is our particular philosophical tradition, our tradition of shared leadership, of however you want to call it. I think that is a good approach. My own society was in search, and we ended up looking outside our tradition, and then had our newly hired leader learn about ethical culture from the clergy community of the AEU. So that's kind of the safe answer. I'll give a more direct answer that at this moment, the national organization is come onto hard times. We've had some major conflicts at the national level. There are conflicts amongst our clergy themselves. And in that atmosphere, it's hard to put together a really solid program. And so I think there is, at least functionally, there's a hiatus in training new people. There are people recently trained, so it's not like there aren't people available at present. I think it does make sense that there's a de facto hiatus while we decide what the future of the movement might look like. So thanks for the question. I hope I did it justice.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I've written a song, and I feel like the ethical thing